What keeps me motivated is this vision that I have and that we share on what is right and what we imagine as a society. And I think it is a vision that is shared by many. So the question is how we as a community can come together and how we can work towards that vision to become the base of collective action. My name is Dávid Vig, and I'm the director of Amnesty International in Hungary. I'm leading the team of 32 people, which fund human rights and the rule of law. When it comes to human rights, we focus on the right to fair trial, we focus on gender equality, we focus on LGBTQI rights, and we focus on the right to protest. I have been engaged with the human rights defenders community here in Hungary for a much longer time. I have been engaged in the LGBTQI movement. I have worked with other human rights organizations engaged on stopping police abuse and ill treatment in prisons. I have observed the human rights backlash in Hungary for more than 15 years now, as a researcher at the beginning, but also working at a grant-making organization. And later, myself, I became a human rights activist working on the ground. And I have seen different steps in the erosion of human rights and rule of law, mostly on three levels. The one is the level of legal action, in which the consecutive Orbán governments try to build up this legal theater in which they can play this play of legal authoritarianism or autocratic legality. They adopt all sorts of new pieces of legislation that ultimately serve the purpose of maintaining the power of the executive and silencing all sorts of voices that would be serving as checks and balances over the powers of the executive. These legislative steps are fortified with narrative smear campaigns, marginalizing different groups in society. And being a member of the LGBTQI community myself, I have experienced a massive attack since 2019 with a campaign in which senior government officials compared same-sex couples who are willing to adopt to pedophiles. And then this evolved into a larger anti-LGBT campaign, attacking the key values of that community that the government promises to protect when it comes to refugees and migrants, when it comes to homeless people, to some extent also the Roma people. So they were portrayed as enemies over the course of these 15 years. And then thirdly, it's also about very personalized campaigns to hunt down individuals who are leading the resistance, who are there to exert additional controls of the power of the executive or lead some groups on the ground. But what probably is very important, that while these smear campaigns that ultimately aim at silencing and exerting chilling effect on the society, they are always there to fortify the legal action. The legal actions are also there to maintain some sort of a facade of democracy. This democracy that we have here is not anymore called a liberal democracy. As many know, Prime Minister Orbán has started to frame it as a special form of democracy, an illiberal democracy. But I think it's far more than that. It's the deliberate use of legal tools to undermine human rights, to undermine legal predictability, to undermine the rule of law. If I look back in time, I think it is really a key step in any authoritarian playbook to start a crackdown with the Constitutional Court or with the Supreme Court, and then get to the ordinary courts to restrict their jurisdiction, to restrict their powers in which they can exercise power over the executive, to pave the way for further legal steps in which human rights and the rule of law could be taken away. And I think in this journey, lawyers have a very important role in which they are trying to slow this down, try to stop this, or to some extent turn it against the autocrats. And I will just use one example. If I think of a 2022 national referendum that was initiated by the government of Hungary to target the LGBTQI community with a national referendum, I think it's really interesting to see that it was this governing majority that changed the quorum that is required for a referendum to be valid in Hungary, because they were afraid of people power. They were afraid that citizens can come together, organize a referendum successfully. So that immediately, right after they came to power, they changed the laws on referendums and made sure that it is almost impossible to have a valid referendum organized by citizens or groups of citizens. And I think especially with this understanding of the legalities and legal technicalities of a referendum, was it possible that the human rights community in Hungary came together and organized a national campaign that ultimately reached almost 2 million people and invalidated a referendum that the government of Hungary initiated with 4 marginalizing questions, really misleading and really discriminatory questions on LGBTQI issues. But no matter how smart and strategic lawyers are, I think it is very important that lawyering and strategic litigation goes hand in hand with people power. This is something that the recent Pride success has shown in Budapest. So even though the government tried to crack down on the right to peaceful assembly and changed the constitution, changed the laws on peaceful assemblies and further regulations as well, it was ultimately the 200,000 people who came together and said, this is enough, we are not going to let it happen, that made it possible to show that this is really a red line that this autocratic ruling at this point in time cannot cross. But it was also fortified with strategic litigation that showed the absurdity of the new regulations. But can you imagine a conversation between human rights activists, me, and the police, in which the police asked me a question, are there going to be gay speakers speaking at an event? And when I say, yes, there will be, but I don't understand how it is a portrayal or propagation of homosexuality, because I'm just a person who happens to be gay and speaks on an event. And then the police has to respond something to this claim on official record. I think these types of conversations, as harmful they are really good in demonstrating how absurd such rights restrictions are. But for that, I think we need some legal arguments and also lawyers who engage in strategic litigation. I recall a conversation I had with a Turkish human rights activist a few years ago, and he said to me that if someone told him 5 years before we had this conversation that someone could get imprisoned in Turkey for the work that they are doing on human rights, he would laugh at them. And look where we are today. So I think this is probably the most important lesson, that you would expect that there is a consensus, even if it's not written, cannot be dissolved. Even the autocrats will have some sort of self-restraint because we have been doing things for decades or for hundreds of years. But no, this consensus is not there for them, even though those who play from the democratic playbook, those people and groups, they would respect that consensus. The autocrats wouldn't. And there may be every day a new level of law which is undermining previous experiences of bad and worse things happen. I think it is very important not to forget what your organizational mission is, because some of these ideas are thrown into the public discourse for absorbing energy, for taking away your attention from what your group, what your association came together to do. And it's very important not to forget what's your mission and what's your vision is for a society. Also, I think at the beginning we have probably invested far too little in activist well-being. One could say that, yeah, this will go away in a few years. This will just pass after some time. But the problem is that even though if a government is not re-elected in 4 years, the ideas that they throw into the public debate, the types of conversations that they have opened, they will stay with the society. So it is very important that we are prepared for a long-term fight. We are prepared to achieve success, and we are prepared to maintain our well-being for the years to come, because it's not a sprint, it's a long time, an ultra marathon, I would say. In Hungary, we have been operating under 4 consecutive governments of Prime Minister Orbán. I think one thing that is very important to maintain energy and engagement is around understanding what success is. There are times when you could think of positive impact in terms of you achieving something on the positive side of things. But there are times also where you really have to reassess what success is. For example, in our terms, I think oftentimes we see success as something which is about doing the right thing, not necessarily a human rights win, but doing the right thing, and also mobilizing people to do the right thing, which ultimately will result in the autocrats are only able to make things worse in a much slower pace than they would be if we were not there. Also, learning from other places is a key thing. So unfortunately, the autocratic playbook is pretty similar in many places. For me as a lawyer, it took a long time understanding how legal arguments not work for those who are undecided in a controversial issue. Autocrats have this tactic of polarizing the society. They throw issues that divide the society to two groups, and they hope that the majority is with them. In this polarization, arguments that start with very strong legal rationale for public campaigns is not always working. It may work with the core constituency, but it doesn't necessarily work with the undecided. And I think it was a learning curve for myself, trying to understand how important it is that we base our messages to hope-based, value-based arguments, because through that we can explain much better what is important to us in terms of values. And I think we have used it successfully in our recent campaigns. So where was the legal community when all these laws restricting the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court, the independent institutions, the Ombudsperson's office, the ordinary courts happened? Where was the legal community then? And when were we at the point where we could have said that this is the end, this is the moment when the rule of law has ended in this country, and from this moment on, we cannot, as a legal community, consider the legal system as such in which rule of law prevails. And we never had such a moment, but nevertheless, the legal community here in Hungary is still thinking on how to restore the rule of law. Can you do this without respecting the principles of rule of law? How would you be able to restore the basic legal principles, not just in human rights, but legality and so on and so forth, like basic values around a rule of law, if you have political appointees in key positions that are there to block it? I think this is a key question that many lawyers tend to ask. And so there is some responsibility for the legal community, but so is for each and every profession. How are we able to exert resistance individually? How are we able to do that collectively? What happens if there is no collective action because of chilling effect, because we do not have the same resources for paid advertisements? We really need to have cost efficient and really need to be creative and sometimes a little bit provocative in our campaigning. So just one example, when the government in Hungary came out with this Russian-style anti-LGBTQ propaganda law back in 21 that almost erased entirely LGBTQI content from schools, media, large parts of the media, from films and TVs, under the notion that the portrayal of homosexuality is harmful to children. That's how they argued. We came out with a national poster campaign. Our poster said, with great letters, "Be gay," as if we would be propagating homosexuality, but obviously the sentence under it continued, "Be gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, homeless, women, refugee," and so on and so forth. Human rights are applicable for all. This was the whole sentence. But what you saw first is something that could have been framed as propagation of homosexuality. And this, in this very polarized public discourse, it grabs a lot of public attention. And there was a huge public discussion about whether this framing is good or not. And I think we were able to reach many people with this actually very cheap public campaigning. Sometimes we tend to think that it's the best if human rights activists coming from the community are speaking in talking head videos. But actually we learned over the years that other people, just the representatives of the society, far better to relate to for the audience. So for example, we used this tactic again when we did the referendum campaign. It was mostly not LGBTQI people who were used as messengers in our videos, but rather their loved ones, their family members, their friends, their grandparents, who talked about how they love their LGBTQI relatives or friends or co-workers, which I think was a great way to bring this message to a broader audience. But it's very counterintuitive for any human rights defender to use someone else to deliver that message than ourselves. To be in a community and be in an environment where we get a lot of support from each other. This is an activist community in which we understand that if the movement has one visible leader, then it could be equally effective, but it could be also hunted down by a government-aligned smear campaign much more easily. So being in a community where we support each other, but none of us is really coming alone in the spotlight without the support of others, I think is probably a good strategy in contexts like ours. The nature of the Orbán system is to crack down on civil society in a way that it divides us, that it generates tension between civil society actors, how it is really their strategy to try to make sure that we spend a lot of time arguing with each other as opposed to fighting for human rights and the rule of law. And what keeps me motivated is this vision that I have and that we share on what is right and what we imagine as a society. And I think it is a vision that is shared by many. So the question is how we as a community can come together and how we can work towards that vision to become the base of collective action. When I think of the developments in the US, they may be different in terms of the size of the country, in terms of the impact it may have on the global world order, but the patterns that we observe there are pretty similar to, for example, what we have gone through, starting with attacks on the courts, starting with attacks on the media, starting with attacks on independent civil society and independent academia. And this is not without reason, obviously. This is not just because it works to restrict the power on the executive, but this is also because societies became so fragmented that everyone is trying to defend their own position, professional group, their own existential environment. And it's hard to think when you are under attack in joint collective action in which you show solidarity for the others as well who are being attacked. You sometimes think that if you stay silent, you may stay under the radar and they're not going to come after you. That is a huge, huge mistake, I think, because you remaining silent will not avoid any attacks or will not protect you against any attacks that may happen in the future. This is maybe not a universal resistance pays off in terms of not letting you silence with chilling effect. Autocrats will go as far in these environments like Hungary as much as they need to achieve their goals. And if you are not silent, then you will be able to occupy some space and probably turn back things against the autocrats' will. That if there is a demonstration for the independence of courts, it's important for people who work in public education to go there to show solidarity, because they should expect that same solidarity when the schools are being attacked. Sometimes we think that this is only about one issue, but this is not just a one issue attack. This is a frontal attack that has a longer trend and a strategy behind it. We should also expect that solidarity is being shown when the other group or institution is being attacked. And I think it is very important to understand, because autocrats use this tactic of dividing the society and maybe target an institution that no one has ever heard of. But by the time that institution's independence is undermined, they are not going to be there to protect the next in line when they are being attacked.